All right. Are we ready to go, Mr. Young? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This meeting will come to order. This is the regular meeting of the Land Use and Transportation Committee. I'm Supervisor Malia Cohen, chair of this committee, and to my right is Supervisor Scott Weiner, who is the vice chair. And to my left is Supervisor Aaron Peskin. Our clerk is Mr. Victor Young. I'd like to take a moment and thank Phil Jackson and Jesse Larson from SFGov TV for broadcasting this meeting. Mr. Clerk, do you have any announcements?
Yes, please silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the March 8, 2016 Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Thank you very much. Could you please call item number 4?
Item number 4, ordinance amending the planning code to allow an existing bar on the ground floor in the Upper Market Street Neighborhood Commercial Transit District to expand to the second floor under specified circumstances with a conditional use authorization.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Weiner is the sponsor of this item. I'll give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Colleagues, the legislation before us today is narrowly crafted to provide a path forward for existing second-floor bar uses under certain circumstances to become legal under the planning code in the Upper Market Neighborhood Commercial Transit Zoning District. The legislation was considered and supported unanimously by the Planning Commission, and it has been endorsed by the Castro Upper Market Community Benefit District, Castro Merchants, and the DuBose Triangle Neighborhood Association. The legislation does not legalize existing second-floor bar uses in Upper Market. Instead, it provides a new conditional use pathway for existing spaces with internal stairway connections, providing a pathway to move forward. So I ask for your support, and the Planning Department is here if there are any questions. Actually, maybe I'll invite Mr. Starr up, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Supervisor Weiner. I'm just here to report that the Planning Commission did hear this item on February 4th of this year and recommended unanimously for approval. I'm available for questions as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Seeing that there's no questions on the board, on the committee, let's see if we have anyone that would like to speak for public comment. Just as a reminder, public comment is for everyone. If you'd like to comment on item 4, please do so. You'll have 2 minutes. You'll hear a soft chime indicating 30 seconds left. If you're interested, please come up. Seeing none, public comment is closed at this time.
No, someone was coming up.
Are you coming up? Public comment is closed at this time. Thank you. All right, Mr. Weiner, what would you like to do?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we forward item 4 to the full Board of Supervisors with a positive recommendation.
All right, thank you very much. There's been a motion made. We'd like to move it with a positive recommendation unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Thank you, Mr. Weiner. Mr. Clerk, let's call item number 1, please. Supervisor Peskin is the sponsor of this item.
Item number 1.
Yes.
Resolution declaring the intention of the Board of Supervisors to order the vacation.
Excuse me, Mr. Young. Could you please call 1 and 2 together?
Yes. Item number 1, resolution declaring the intention of the Board of Supervisors to order the vacation of James Anley, generally bonded by Assessor's Block number 0192 and Jackson Street as part of the improvements to the Chinese Hospital, and setting the hearing date for all persons interested in the proposed vacation of said public right-of-way. Item number 2, ordinance ordering the street vacation of James Alley, generally bonded by Assessor's Block number 0192 and Jackson Street as part of the improvements to the Chinese Hospital, approving a quick claim of the city's interest in the vacation area pursuant to terms and conditions of a purchase and sales agreement between the City and County of San Francisco as seller and Chinese Hospital Association as buyer, reserving various easement rights in favor of third-party utilities and private property owners.
Thank you. Mr. Peskin?
Madam Chair, subject to public comment, I would like to make a motion to continue these 2 items to our meeting next week.
Okay. Is there a motion?
Sure. I move that we continue these items to the meeting of next Monday.
Thank you for repeating that. I appreciate that. All right. Without objection, let's take public comment before we vote on this motion. Is there any public comment on items 1 and 2? All right. Seeing none, public comment is closed. And without objection, this item will be continued.
Yes, this item will be continued to March 7th, 2016.
That is correct. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Clerk, could you please call item number 3?
Item number 3, resolution urging the Board and Directors of the Treasure Island Development Authority to develop a series of recommendations on how the city can utilize the formation of a community revitalization and investment authority to increase the affordability of housing on Treasure Island to 40%.
Thank you. Supervisor Kim is the author of this item. I don't see her here yet, so let's skip this item and go to item number 5, Mr. Clerk. Thank you.
Item number 5, ordinance amending the planning code to require conditional use authorization for the removal of any residential unit and to exempt from the conditional use application requirement unauthorized units where there is no legal path for legalization, residential units that have received prior planning approval, and single-family homes that are demonstrable, unaffordable, or unsound, amending the building code to require the notices of violation ordered, the filing of an application to legalize an unauthorized unit unless infeasible under the building code, and the Planning Commission's approves its removal.
Thank you. Mr. Pescott, I see your name on the list.
No, that was from before. I did.
Okay. You did perfect. Supervisor Avalos is here just in time. Mr. Supervisor Avalos, we just called item number 5. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
No problem.
A little bit out of breath from running over. This is the third piece that's left in our housing preservation measure that is securing housing for tenants and in-law units and single-family homes. That's what's left. I believe we're working on language to perhaps apply discretionary review, mandatory discretionary review versus conditional use. And I think we're still waiting on language. So I'd like to, working with Supervisor Wiener, continue this. I'm not sure if next week would be.
So would you like
Supervisor Wiener probably has a better angle on what's the changes because he was proposing the amendments to require mandatory discretionary review.
I was under the impression that we needed to re-refer this to the Planning Commission and perhaps continue it to the call of the chair, but maybe Mr. Givner can enlighten us.
Sure. Deputy City Attorney John Givner. What I understand the conversations have been is that you're talking about different options about how the discretionary review instead of a CU might work that may require referral back to planning. Rather than working out those amendments here, the committee could continue to the call of the chair, as Supervisor Wiener says, and seek some input from the Planning Commission, go to the Planning Commission with potential amendments, and then the chair could, after the Planning Commission meeting, the chair of this committee could reschedule this item and you could make the amendments at that time.
So I think the motion I'd like to make, and I'll solicit any input from Supervisor Avalos, would be to continue the item to the call, to move that we continue the item to the call of the chair, as well as referring it to the Planning Commission or re-referring it to the Planning Commission for a hearing and feedback. And then once that is done, the chair can then reschedule it at this committee.
All right. Looks like we're in agreement. Thank you. There's been a motion to move to the call of the chair without objection.
We have public comment.
Excuse me?
Public comment.
Let's take public comment at this time on item number 5. Anyone that'd like to speak on item number 5? All right. Public comment is closed at this time. The motion has been made, and without objection, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Of course. Supervisor Kim's the author of item 3. I've asked that her staff come down and present in her absence. Let's just keep moving forward. Could you please recall item 3?
Item number 3, resolution urging the Board of Directors of the Treasure Island Development Authority to develop a series of recommendations on how the city can utilize the formation of a community revitalization and investment authority to increase the affordability of housing on Treasure Island to 40%.
Thank you. Forgive me, is there a staff presentation on item 3?
Morning. Bob Beck with the Treasure Island Development Authority.
Hey, Bob.
I do have some background information
Perfect.
on the housing plan for Treasure Island that I could present.
Please present.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair Cohen, members of the committee.
Thank you.
Bob Beck with the Treasure Island Development Authority. And as context for today's discussion, just a moment. Wanted to provide some background on the housing plan and financing plan for the Treasure Island Development Program, some context of the housing plan as it was adopted in 2011, and some of the challenges and opportunities that are before us as we move forward with the program. The housing program for Treasure Island calls for the construction of 8,000 new residential units, 25% of which, or 2,000 units, would be affordable. 435 of those affordable units are to be constructed by the Treasure Island Homeless Development Initiative, and 316, or 5%, would be inclusionary units constructed by the developer. The balance of the affordable units would be constructed by TIDA in conjunction with the Mayor's Office of Housing. The map before you shows the sites that were in the land use plan for the construction of affordable housing, and there are 4 sites that are indicated that were originally programmed for affordable housing when the program was proposed to be 30% affordable, and there's still the opportunity that those could be available. And then there are 20 sites that are in the current land use plan for the development of affordable housing. So some of the challenges and opportunities that are before us with the land use plan for Treasure Island are challenges on the revenue side and the cost side and timing, as well as some opportunities that are embodied in the land use plan to increase the affordable housing to either 27% or 30% affordable. The context in 2011, our program, as I mentioned, was originally envisioned to provide 30% affordable, but it was originally envisioned to be a redevelopment area and utilize redevelopment tax increment, including the state share of tax increment, to help finance the affordable housing. And the affordable housing percentage for Treasure Island is affected by some of the very high infrastructure costs that we have associated with our program, including the geotechnical work required on the island, as well as entirely new utilities, new transit infrastructure, including ferry terminal, and 300 acres of open space that will be developed as part of our program. In February of 2011, the governor, Governor Brown, indicated his intention to abolish redevelopment in California, and that left our program with needing to reevaluate how the public infrastructure on the island would be financed in the absence of redevelopment. So the solution to move forward was to replace redevelopment tax increment financing with an infrastructure financing district, which would utilize the commitment by the city and county of the local property tax revenue to fund the public infrastructure on the island. The tax increment, the big difference, though, was that we went from having 80% of the tax increment to just 64% of tax increment being available through the local share. In looking at how to adjust to that loss in revenue, there are many elements of the financing of the public infrastructure that are not discretionary. The geotechnical work that we need to do to improve the island, the open space improvements, the new utilities, we didn't have a lot of flexibility there. And so, unfortunately, the program element that bore the brunt of the dissolution of redevelopment was the affordable housing. And the affordable housing participation was changed from 30% to 25%. The housing plan, final housing plan, utilized 57% of the tax increment from the local share, as well as a commitment from the developer of $17,500 per market rate door to help fund the affordable housing component. This table summarizes the differences between the 25% and 30% in 2011 as it was envisioned and put forward. Again, the larger a loss of 400 units of affordable housing, but still staying with the environmental approval to construct 8,000 total units. Because of the uncertainty around redevelopment at the time of the development approvals were adopted, there were provisions in the housing plan that contemplated the potential reestablishment or authorization of redevelopment, including which would automatically revert the program back to 30% if these key characteristics of redevelopment were reconstituted, that there would be 60% of the tax increment available for public infrastructure improvements, that the eligibility of the IFD were extended from the then current 30 years to 45 years, and that basically the other elements of redevelopment law, the eligible improvements, would be consistent with what was available under redevelopment law. If only some of those provisions are met, there is a provision for us to revert back to 27% affordable housing. So the challenges and opportunities that are before us, Supervisor Kim's resolution spoke specifically to AB2, but there have been 3 different state legislations passed since 2011 modifying the rules under which an infrastructure financing district can be formed. AB2 and also EIFD, or Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, or an IRFD, an Infrastructure and Revitalization Financing District. In terms of term, both the EIFD and AB2 provide for a 45-year term. The IRFD provides for a 40-year term, but has some additional flexibility in when that clock is started for individual areas within the financing district, so that some of the differences in term are largely mitigated by flexibility in the timing of that 40-year requirement. The EIFD also authorizes the local entity to commit and leverage vehicle license in lieu property tax fees from the state in addition to the local property tax share. But otherwise, AB2, IRFD, and EIFD all really only relate to the local pledge of tax increment and not any pledge of the state tax increment share. And so from that perspective, AB2 does not grow the pie of available funding for affordable housing. Again, summarize the differences from redevelopment law. Again, none of these provide access to the state share of redevelopment tax increment. Each of them require an election from the district, and minor differences in the authorized improvements. And the EIFD and IRFD have no specific affordable housing requirement. The AB2 does have a 25% affordable housing requirement, as well as AB2 has a provision which calls for a review and potential reauthorization vote every 10 years, which seems to be a significant challenge to using the AB2 framework. In terms of delivering the 25% affordable housing that is currently in our plan, we do have some challenges. There were certain funding sources that were included in the pro forma in 2011 that are no longer available to help finance affordable housing. Also, we've seen a significant increase in construction costs over the last 5 years, so that we're looking at a hard cost of construction almost 50% higher than what we were looking at in 2011. So we have some challenges on the cost and revenue side to deliver the 25%. But we're working with tie-dye and the Mayor's Office of Housing to update our pro formas to both look at how we fund the affordable housing and over what time frame can we deliver the affordable housing program. And this map just shows you when the parcels are expected to be made available to TIDA and tie-dye over the next 12 years through 2030. And so that would be our earliest opportunity for developing each of these parcels. In terms of the opportunities, the housing plan and financing plan do call for us at 5 years following the effective date of the development agreement to review whether or not the changes have been made to reconstitute redevelopment. And that 5-year horizon is coming up this summer. If the changes have been made to reconstitute or replicate the public financing that would be available, would have been available under the redevelopment law, as I said, we would have the option to revert to 30% affordable. If only some of those changes have been made, we have an option to revert to 27% affordable. And we're running pro formas at each of these levels, both on the revenue side and the cost side, so that we'll be able to better assess what our time horizon for delivering the housing would be, as well as the gap. So I mentioned works in progress. We are updating the 25% affordable and looking at opportunities to fund that gap. We're going to prepare a pro forma at 27%, identifying a new mix of both units and housing types to be able to deliver the 27% pro forma, and then looking at what our gap would be if 30%, if we were able to meet the housing plan requirements to revert to 30%. With that, I'll conclude my comments.
Your presentation, we appreciate it. Supervisor Wiener.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you for that presentation, which was, I think, very detailed and very helpful in actually updating us on the current financing for the Treasure Island project, as well as some of the challenges that the project faces. This is a wonderful project that I know enjoyed, if I recall correctly, unanimous support from the Board of Supervisors, and will just be transformational. And so I think it's something that we all support. I know we also, every single one of us, wants to have as much affordable housing as we can from our projects, and particularly our major projects. It's also important to be I think very open and transparent with the public and not just throw around numbers that may or may not be achievable or that may require significant diversion of public resources from other uses, including maybe other affordable housing, to get there. And we did have a discussion at the full board last week about this whole notion of 40% affordable housing, which is wonderful. If we can get to 40% affordable housing, I'm all for it. But there was sort of an implication that 40%, hashtag 40 is the new 30, that was somehow being extracted from the developer. That the developer had been, through intense and hard-nosed negotiations, the developer had agreed to put in 40%, when we know from the 5M project that that's not true. It was about half of that, more like 20%, and the rest came from taxpayer subsidies. And with the 160 Folsom Street project, we also know, which was touted and announced as a hashtag 40 is a new 30, 40% affordable project, that half of that 20% was coming from the developer, the other half was being paid for by the taxpayers of San Francisco. And I'm not saying that that's a bad model. We should be using significant taxpayer dollars to build affordable housing, and in fact we do, and that's a good use of public funds during this housing crisis. But it's important that we also are very candid with the public, that we're not just extracting concessions from developers to do 40%, that the public is actually paying for that. So I wanted to just ask a few questions to make sure I understand. Right now, the approved Treasure Island development plan is 25% affordable. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I just heard from you that given some changes in funding sources and escalation in construction costs, that there are some challenges for this project to achieve the 25%.
Yes, there are some challenges on the cost and revenue side that we're assessing.
Right. Okay. And then I see that there are these two options under the current plan or the current direction, that if certain things fall into place, there's an option one to increase the affordable from 25% to 27.2%, and then option two would be to go from 25% to 30%. And what would have to happen financially? Like, where would the money come from to go from 25 to 27.2%, or from 25 to 30%?
In both cases, additional public resources would need to be brought to the project. To get to 30%, we would need to be able to dedicate at least 60%, the equivalent of 60% of the current tax increment, to to the developer delivered public infrastructure improvements on the project, and so that would currently we have 57% tax increment dedicated to the public financing of the project, and 82.5% of that 57%, or roughly 47% total, is dedicated to the public infrastructure improvement. So we would need to grow the amount of money first to be able to match the dedication to the public infrastructure components of 60%, and then we would also need to address the gap to deliver the additional affordable housing. That was originally envisioned, I believe, in 2011, that the way to do that would be to increase the state pledge, or to recapture a state pledge of the ERAF share. However, that has not come to pass.
So in terms of increasing the percentage of tax increment for this infrastructure needs, including affordable housing, where would that's tax increment is just a term of art. It's tax dollars.
Correct.
That are being dedicated to, whether it's infrastructure or affordable housing, whatever the case may be. So in moving even to the 30% affordable housing, you'd have to increase the amount of tax increment that's being utilized for it. Where would that money come from? Like, what would that tax increment have otherwise been used for?
The fiscal analysis for the development of Treasure Island showed that, again, there's 64% of the property tax that is available to the city and county. Of that, currently 57% has been pledged to the project. So there's 7% of property tax increment, along with other sources generated by the development of the project, that are going to the general fund to fund other general fund costs associated with the additional population that the island will see. 64%
of the tax increment generated by the Treasure Island project is available to the city of San Francisco. The other 36%, it goes to the school district, to City College, to other required uses who are partners who share in our property tax.
Yes, and the state.
On the state. And so the 64% available to the city, right now about 57% is pledged to the infrastructure and affordable housing needs of this Treasure Island project. The other approximately 7% goes into the city of San Francisco's general fund.
Correct.
And that's for whether it's public health or parks or roads or police or fire or affordable housing if we choose to use it for affordable housing, whether it's in the Bayview or the Castro or South of Market or wherever the case may be.
Correct.
Okay, and so to get to 30%, we would be taking that 7% of the property taxes generated by Treasure Island project and saying we're simply going to make a policy decision to use that to buy additional and pay for additional affordable housing on Treasure Island.
That's one option.
Okay, and I'm not saying that I'm in any way, I'm not expressing an opinion about whether we should do that. That could be a perfectly terrific use of that money to build more affordable housing on Treasure Island, but I think it's important for the public to understand that that is a choice of using tax dollars. We can choose to use those for more affordable housing on Treasure Island or to build affordable housing in other neighborhoods. Again, I mentioned South of Market or Castro or Bayview or the Sunset or wherever else, or for mental health services or supportive housing for homeless in other parts of the city, for a million different reasons. It's just important to understand that this is not like the developer coming up with more money. It is public taxpayer money. Now, to get to the 40%, so we know already to get from 25 to 30% would require the city to basically dedicate the remaining tax increment that is not currently dedicated to the Treasure Island project. To get to 40%, so another 10% on top of that. You mentioned that there are some state laws, and I think one or two of them are mentioned in Supervisor Kim's resolution. I think you said that currently does not have any available money for this purpose?
AB2, which is mentioned in the resolution, provides a framework for the establishment of an infrastructure financing district, but it only deals with the local sources of revenue. It doesn't make available any state sources.
Okay, so and an infrastructure financing district is when we say we're going to dedicate, as we just discussed, the tax increment that's being generated by the new project to fund infrastructure or affordable housing or whatever else the case may be.
Correct.
So AB2 does not provide any kind of state funding. It simply says San Francisco can make a choice that we're going to use what would otherwise be general fund taxpayer money to build more affordable housing.
Yes, it provides a third alternative framework to the infrastructure and revitalization financing district or the enhanced infrastructure financing district.
And again, I say all this not to say what's a good idea or a bad idea, because again, it might be the absolute best use of these resources to say let's get Treasure Island up to 30, 35, or even 40%. But I think, again, it's really important for the public to understand that this is not about going to the Treasure Island developer and saying, we want to just bargain with you and have a hard-nosed negotiation and get you, Mr. Developer or Ms. Developer, to put up more affordable housing from your profits. That's not what is being discussed here, just as that was not what was happening with 5M or with 160 Folsom, that we're talking about San Francisco taxpayer money going into the project to increase the affordability, which again could be a terrific thing, and affordable housing is a great use of taxpayer money, but it's important to be clear about what we'll actually be paying for this. Now, in terms of so you just said that the city of San Francisco has control in some way or another of 64% of the tax increment that's being generated by this project. 36% we have no control over. It's school district, city college, the state, et cetera. So of that, we're already at 57% pledge to the Treasure Island project for infrastructure and affordable housing. To get it to 30% from 25%, we'd have to use the entire 64% to do that. In terms of what sources would pay to go from, say, 30% to 40%, would that just be an additional transfer from the San Francisco General Fund?
We haven't run pro formas yet on 40%, but so getting to 30% would require the 64% local tax increment share, plus in all likelihood some additional public financing. To go from 30 to 40% would require another source of public funds. It would also require us to go back and modify the development agreement with the developer, and potentially also to modify the conveyance agreement from the naming.
And then getting from 30 to 40%, do you have a sense, what is the, in terms of the number of dollars involved, what does that cost approximately? I know just a range would even be terrific.
It would be a very rough range, but we'd be talking in excess of $100 million.
Okay, so to get from 30% to 40%, after we've already dedicated every penny of tax increment and then some, to get to 30%, have to spend in excess of $100 million. And so I think that can come from the San Francisco General Fund, $100 million. It could come from developer in lieu fees. It could come perhaps out of the affordable housing bond that we just passed, or out of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, possibly. Those are some sources that come to mind. But again, all of those require choices. If it's coming out of the general fund, it means it's either not funding affordable housing elsewhere, or it's coming from other critical city services. If it's coming out of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, or out of developer in lieu fees, or out of the bond, again, that's already money that has been programmed for affordable housing, and it just means that we made a decision to build that affordable housing on Treasure Island, which could be a terrific decision. It, may or may not be. We know that there are other parts of the city that really could use more affordable housing to achieve greater geographic equity in affordable housing. Okay, this has been really helpful, and I really appreciate the information.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. Supervisor Kim has joined us. Supervisor Kim, would you like to say a couple words?
Thank you, Chair Cohen. I apologize that I wasn't able to make introductory comments for the resolution that I introduced, but I do want to thank our Director, Bob Beck, for being here today. The purpose of the hearing that I've called is really to begin a conversation about how we can increase the affordability levels on Treasure Island, and what are the multiple proposals and pathways that we can examine to get to that. When we had originally conceived of the Treasure Island development plan, it was originally a redevelopment area plan where we had committed to achieving 30% affordable housing using public tax increment to bond against. When we learned that redevelopment had the possibility of dissolving, we decided to make the advanced decision of moving to an IFD structure that limited our ability to use tax increment to build more affordable housing, thereby lowering our percentage of affordable housing to 25%. It has been something I've thought about over the last 5 years in terms of how we can get back to our original commitment of 30%. The introduction of AB2, signed by the governor in the fall, was a reopening of that conversation. And so the hearing request that I made in the fall was to examine whether AB2 could help us capture more of the tax increment that we could bond against to build more affordable housing on Treasure Island. And if not, if it is not a tool that would help us, which was the assessment of the report that we got today, what are other ways that we can do to buy in and plow more money into this development to build more affordable housing? I want to appreciate Supervisor Wiener's questions, but I think it's important that we build affordable housing where there is development potential and entitlement. There isn't development throughout the entire city where we can create more geographic equity. We know where the building is happening. Close to 80% of it is happening in the district that I represent. And if we know that we are building 8,000 units of housing already that's already entitled, then we should look at these projects and examine to see how we can increase affordability levels in these developments that we know are going to that are in the pipeline, and that we can plow additional funding in. I'm certainly interested in examining the affordable housing bond, the $350 million, which, thanks to our voters, was passed so that property owners could contribute to us building more affordability in the city, so their children, their grandchildren can afford to live in the city that they call home. And also examining what other options are available. I'm really excited to work very closely with the Treasure Island Development Authority Commission. Jeff Kaczynski is here as a member of the commission, have been working very closely with him and Linda Richardson, and Fay, along with former member John Elberling, who's also in the audience, to really examine ways that we can bring our affordability back up. And because we are achieving new levels of affordability within large developments, now at 40%, including middle-income housing, examining what are the multiple ways and options that the city can look at raising the affordability levels in this development. I also think that it's important that we re-examine the 2 amendments to the DDA that I was able to get in after last-minute negotiations with the commitment of the development, with the developer. One was to increase the percentage of affordable units to 27.5%, and allowing for an increase to 30% should state law change occur within 5 years. That 5 years is coming up this upcoming June in the next couple of months. And so this is really the time period that we should be examining what our options are. Supervisor Avalos, Chu, Cohen, and Wiener joined me in supporting then Assemblyman Tom Amiano, who authored the legislation AB 664 to amend state IFD law to allow Treasure Island to utilize tax increment to build up to 30% affordable housing. Ultimately, we were not successful in ensuring the inclusion of Treasure Island in AB 664. But again, AB 2, reestablishing redevelopment as a tool for cities and counties throughout the state of California, opened the dialogue up again about what is conceivable and what is possible. And so we've called upon the TIDA board and staff to explore AB 2's impact on Treasure Island and develop recommendations to leverage legislation and other means to establish 40% on Treasure Island. And being very clear about looking at 30 to 33% affordable from the 0 to 120% average median income range, and filling the rest with what we have done in other deals, which is up to 150% of average median income, knowing that we are vastly underbuilding middle-income housing, households that make between $80,000 to $150,000 a year. The city is woefully underproducing in this category, and that we believe that it's important to figure out ways to utilize our general funds, which I believe our voters support. They want our taxpayer dollars to be used to invest in making the city more affordable. So I know that you've gone through the presentation, which I've already looked through, and you've looked at creating a pro forma at both 25, I'm sorry, let me pull this up, at both, I'm sorry, at 25 and 27.5%, which is what we're currently at, and 27.5, which is what we will automatically move into place after June. Is that correct?
Yes, and also at 30%.
And also at 30%. And could you explain for the members of the public how the amendment that we were able to negotiate last minute in 2011, how do we get to the 27.5%? The housing plan, Section 9 of the housing plan, has a very explicit provision if the fundamental structural elements of redevelopment law are reconstituted, that we would automatically revert to 30% as originally planned. If only some of those measures are taken, for instance, the liberalization of what are eligible public infrastructure in construction costs, or partial restoration of the funding that was available for public improvements, we would automatically revert at the end of 5 years to a specific number of market rate and affordable units. It equates to about 27.2% when you do all of the math. So sometimes it's been referred to as 27, and sometimes it's 27.5%. So that would be an automatic reversion at the end of that 5-year period. If we weren't able to go to 30%, that would automatically revert to 27%. At 27%, we would need to, there was not a pro forma done in 2011 on what the assumptions would be about the mix of units types and unit sizes and housing, senior versus family. So we'll need to generate a new set of assumptions about what that would be. But that additional entitlement authorization to the city
would be on the existing 20 parcels. So we would be, through increasing density on existing sites, that we would accomplish that 27%.
And I just also wanted to ask, since our policy is really to try to create 33% affordable whenever possible, if we could also do a pro forma at 33% on top of the 25, 27.5, and 30%.
Yeah, I could request that. Again, we've focused on the provisions that are within the housing plan, because the other provisions would require reopening a negotiation with the developer about modifying the financing and housing plan, but we can certainly run that pro forma to have that information for you.
And my understanding is that the developer is already looking at redoing the pro formas given the changes in costs since 2011. Is that correct?
We are working with tie-dye to update the pro formas for the affordable housing. The developer is also updating the pro formas for the costs of the infrastructure that they are obligated to provide. Mm-hmm. So we're taking a look at all of the program costs.
And just for the education, in explaining how tax increment and infrastructure financing districts work for the sake of the public, because it is very confusing how we utilize this tool to build infrastructure and to build affordable housing. Are we, through the IFD at Treasure Island, are we permitted to bond against future tax increment?
Yeah, for members of the public, maybe I'll take it down to even lower level. The existing property on Treasure Island historically was Navy property, and so the city and the state did not collect any property taxes on that land. Mm-hmm. As it turns into private ownership and homes are developed, the property tax that is assessed on the property is roughly 1% of the property value per year. Mm-hmm. For the purposes of our program, that those property tax revenues would all be considered tax increment. And an infrastructure financing district allows the city to pledge our share of the property taxes collected from that district as the property values increase to borrow against those future property tax revenues to finance both the public infrastructure improvements as well as affordable housing on the island. So
is it fair to characterize us as borrowing money through bonding on future tax increment of property taxes that are not currently available today to the city and county of San Francisco?
Yes, that's the
so
mechanism.
It would be a mischaracterization to say that these are general fund dollars that we can use in any neighborhood, because those are dollars that are not available today. But if we have an IFD where we can bond against future tax increment, but of course limited to the neighborhood where we're creating that tax value, that these general fund dollars in the future can't just be used anywhere in the neighborhoods today. Is that correct?
Well, these are often called project-generated revenues.
Right.
So they're projects that would not exist but for the development that's taking place, and so that's the nexus by which we borrow against them and leverage them to finance the things that make the development possible.
And can we plow that money into any neighborhood in San Francisco?
If it were not pledged to the program, it would become a general fund revenue.
In the future.
In the future, yeah.
Right, but today, if we were to bond today against future tax increment, can we use those dollars to build affordable housing anywhere in the city?
No, my understanding of infrastructure finance law is it needs to be done within the district that's being formed.
Which is why we're examining whether we can utilize future tax increment to generate dollars today that don't exist today, bonded against the future value of property tax value increase to build affordable housing today.
Correct.
If we were to wait, of course, to capture that tax increment later as the housing development occurs, of course, those dollars could be used in the future, years and years down the road, over small periods of time in bits and pieces and drips to put into a fund that can eventually amount to a dollar amount that could build more affordable housing in other parts of the city. Is that correct?
Correct.
But if we were able to bond today off a future tax increment, we can actually pool large amounts of capital in the present time, bonded against future tax increment that we don't currently have in a general fund, to build large amounts of affordable housing today.
Yes, that's the mechanism.
Okay. I just think that that's important to clarify to members of the public as to why this is a tool that we utilize, why we plow those dollars into the specific neighborhoods where we generate that. I think, redevelopment is a very complicated tool, tax increment, but it helps us explain why these certain decisions are made and why we examine certain routes in certain neighborhoods to build affordable housing in. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Beck. I do have a couple more questions, but I also want to give
Public comment.
actually a member of your commission time to speak as well. I know Jeff Kaczynski is here, but before that, I do want to give Supervisor Peskin an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Mr. Beck, just relative to the total infrastructure cost absent housing, just to get the basic infrastructure of the island ready for development, I'm talking about the amount of dirt that has to be added to the island to deal with sea rise, the armoring of the perimeter, the creation of a ferry terminal. What's that cost?
The total cost of the geotechnic work, the public improvements, are estimated to be on the order of $1.5 billion.
And what is the actual status of the Treasure Island project today relative to when you believe that those infrastructural improvements will start to proceed?
We expect we took possession from the Navy of the first portions of Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island, about 60% of the land that will ultimately be transferred to the city. We took possession of that property last May. Last week, we transferred the first development parcels to Treasure Island Community Development. They have taken bids on a demolition contract for the structures on Yerba Buena Island that we expect to mobilize within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And they've also taken bids for the construction of the new water storage reservoirs that are to be constructed on Yerba Buena Island. So we expect actual field work to begin in the month of March and proceed over the coming years as we move forward.
But the first phase that you're speaking to is just the Yerba Buena Island development portion.
We have approved the first 2 sub-phases, which include the northern half of Yerba Buena Island. The southern half is the Coast Guard station, as well as the first sub-phases on Treasure Island, which are located at the southwestern corner of Treasure Island along the city-side waterfront where the Casa de la Vista is located.
And how many years before you get to the main event, which is the costly infrastructural improvements on Treasure Island itself as compared to Yerba Buena?
The geotechnical work, the developer has advertised their first demolition contract for Treasure Island as well, just last week. And we expect the geotechnical work on the causeway and in this area of Treasure Island to begin in the fall of this year.
And how are we doing with the hazardous remediation situation?
As I mentioned, about 60% of the island has transferred to us. That's an area that where the Navy has completed all of their work. The Navy is working on their next finding of suitability to transfer, which will transfer 3 additional parcels to us. They expect to make that offer May, June of this year. The other environmental cleanup sites on the island, we expect all of them, with the exception of what is Site 12, which is the residential area, to be completed in the next 2 years. So by this time in 2018, we will be down to 1 environmental remediation site. That last site is not expected to be completed until the end of 2021.
And relative to the number of the 8,000 units that are being proposed, the sub-phases on YBI are how many of those units?
On YBI is 300 units.
So in the near term, we're looking at 300 units.
Well, the first sub-phase area on Treasure Island will be about additional 1,200 units, so 1,500 units in these initial 2 sub-phases.
Thank you.
Sure.
Supervisor Peskin.
You already spoke. Me?
Did you speak? Are you done?
No.
All right.
No,
So let's go ahead and. Okay. Excuse me, Supervisor Weiner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to appreciate Supervisor Kim's comments, and she's absolutely correct that when you're bonding against future tax revenue, then you're able to borrow that money up front. You can spend it now and then pay it back with interest over time because you pledge future tax revenues, and that's what an IFD is, as well as some other tax structures that we're able to use to accelerate the expenditure of tax revenue. But I still think the point of my questioning was just to make clear, and I think Supervisor Kim is in agreement, that what we're talking about here by increasing the percentage of affordability in Treasure Island, which I'm not saying I'm in any way opposed to increasing that affordability. It's always a good thing to really push the envelope on affordability, but that is coming from effectively from the general fund of the city of San Francisco, and that we're making a decision now that we are pledging future general fund tax revenues for many years to come, that instead of that money coming into the general fund for us to expend in the budget process every year for whether it's affordable housing or mental health services or police or fire or parks, whatever the case may be, that we're making a decision, not today literally, but now, to take that money off the table, to borrow against it, and to legally pledge it so that it can be spent today for a specific project. In other words, to increase the amount of affordable housing on Treasure Island. That might be a terrific idea, but we are absolutely taking taxpayer money to do that. It's not coming from the developer. And we have a lot of development happening in various parts of the city, and for the most part, when development happens, we see benefits to the general fund. That's why today, for example, because there is a lot of development happening, there's new property taxes, among other taxes being paid, we're able to invest in all sorts of important municipal needs that we haven't been able to invest in the past. And that's because that increased property tax available is, that additional property tax revenue is available in the general fund. If we pledge it and borrow against it, then for decades to come, it's not going to be available. And again, I'm not saying what the right choice is, just saying that we understand there are trade-offs because this is public money. It's not money being extracted from the developer. In addition, as Mr. Beck indicated earlier, even if we pledge every single penny of remaining available property tax revenue from this project, that additional 7%, that maybe gets us from the 25% to the 30%. According to Mr. Beck, it probably doesn't get us there. It probably would still require an additional subsidy from the general fund. So in terms of this 40%, this doesn't even get us anywhere near there. To get to 40%, we would have to pledge the additional 7% of public property taxes, and then we would have to put in additional, at a minimum, $100 million and probably more of taxpayer money, either from the general fund or in lieu fees or some other source. And so again, these are taxpayer-funded trade-offs and we're making those decisions. And that's, I think, the important thing for people to keep in mind.
All right, thank you. Why don't we take a moment and go to public comment? I've got a couple cards that I'd like to bring people up. First, I've got Laura Kahn, followed by Sherry Williams, followed by Dave Lopez, James Tracy, Michael Gobel, Nella Gonçalves, and Jeff Kostitsky.
And Chair Cohen, if I may, through the chair, is it okay if I ask Jeff Kaczynski as a member of the Treasure Island Development Authority Commission to speak first?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kaczynski, and I know that you are leading the effort on the Commission to lead the task force on examining how we increase affordability on Treasure Island development. So thank you for being here to talk about that process and your role.
Thank you, and good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Jeff Kostitsky. I'm in the Treasure Island Development Authority. I'm also the executive director of the Hamilton Family Center. And I am one of, I think, many members of the TIDA Commission that are interested in seeing how much affordable housing, how much more affordable housing we would be able to develop on Treasure Island. I believe we'll be forming a subcommittee to take up this issue and look forward to working with any other task force that gets developed by the city with city staff. And there's just a few comments. I think this is a really unique opportunity that we all have to build a brand new neighborhood from the ground up. I don't know when that's ever occurred before in San Francisco. And I think that this is an important, also a very complex deal, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to take advantage of things that we know now looking forward into the future. I think one of the greatest needs that we have now and we're going to continue to have in the city is the need for more affordable housing. It has created tremendous pressures on middle-class families and lower-income families here in the city. It has become, I think, the #1 issue that's facing the city, and we now have an opportunity to really take a long view and to see how much of this land can we use to develop more affordable housing. I think it's important. It's a very complex deal, and I think it's very important that we not do anything to compromise the deal, to slow down the deal, to not allow this development to be any more delayed than it has been. But I also think at the same time there are various levers that we can look at pulling to see if we can't increase the level of the amount of affordable housing to 30 or 33 or even 40%. I don't want to get into those specifics. I think there's people here who are much more qualified than I to speak about that, including Bob Beck and Olson Lee. But I'd be happy to answer any other questions that supervisors have about where we're at on the TIDA Commission.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I have 2 questions. So one, have we examined possibly increasing the number of years to collect tax increment to increase the amount of funding we have available in the future to bond against for affordable housing? I know that it's currently at 35 years. Is that correct? I'm sorry, maybe that is a question for Director Beck. Sorry to put you on the spot, Jeff.
Thank you, Director Beck. You stole me a lifeline.
The 3 state legislations that we have available to us to form an infrastructure financing district, 2 of them allow us to leverage for 45 years and 1 for 40 years.
Right. And we currently are limited to 35 years, is that correct?
No, when we form the district, we will be using one of these 3 legislations, and so we will either be taking advantage of 40 or 45 years, depending upon the other characteristics of the legislation.
And is it possible to buy or to purchase additional parcels for affordable housing?
Yes, after this 5-year trigger event that's in the housing plan, there is the opportunity within the housing plan for TIDA to purchase additional parcels from the developer in the future at the market value of that parcel.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Koziski.
Thank you.
Okay. First public speaker we'll hear from Lauren Kahn, followed by Sherry Williams, Dave Lopez. I've got Dave, I don't know, Schnitzer, speaking on behalf of James Tracy. Please.
Hi.
Thank
Good
you.
afternoon. My name is Lauren Kahn, and I am from Health Right 360. First, I'd like to thank you for the many ways that you have supported our work. I'm here to speak in support of Supervisor Kim's resolution to convene a work group to make recommendations to establish 40% affordable housing on Treasure Island. For more than a decade, Health Right 360 has operated transitional housing programs in substance use disorder treatment on Treasure Island. Currently, we house over 200 people on the island each night who would otherwise be homeless. The Affordable Care Act has improved some of the challenges that Health Right 360 has faced in providing health care services to homeless individuals. However, federally funded treatment episodes will be capped at 90 days. This is half of what the county funding allows. Right now, due to the lack of affordable housing inventory, we are too often forced to discharge clients into homelessness. For most clients, transitional housing is the only option to bridge the gap into permanent housing. When federal dollars cut residential treatment stays in half in the next few months, these situations will only become more dire. We not only wish to maintain our current stock of affordable transitional housing units on Treasure Island, but would like to see more opportunities to become available. We have been told by the Mayor's Office of Housing that they will have no monies for transitional housing, so we are unsure of how we will afford to build on parcels that we have already been promised, or how we could build additional units. We are hopeful that the work group formed by this resolution will be able to identify feasible options to allow for and help fund 40% affordable housing on Treasure Island. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we line up so that we can have a quicker transition from speaker to speaker.
Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Williams from the Treasure Island Homeless Development Initiative, known as TIDI. I'd like to thank Supervisor Kim for her advocacy for affordable housing on Treasure Island. We're supportive of the greatest affordability that's feasible for the project, and should a task force be created, we respectfully request a seat at that table. Our members are here because we're at a critical juncture. After 20 years of planning, we now have specific dates when the affordable parcels are going to be delivered. The first ones are to come online in 2018, but we don't have the financing available to make these units a reality. The landscape has changed considerably since the plan was approved in 2011. Sources have dried up while costs have escalated. With working with the Mayor's Office of Housing, we're able to identify gap funding for one parcel in 2018, but the rest of the affordable projects are uncertain until 2022-23, and even beyond that, when new capital resources may or may not become available. This leaves literally the potential of hundreds of affordable units offline for years. And we have no assurance from the Mayor's Office of Housing that we will be able to build these units. This lack of funding is unacceptable and problematic for a number of reasons. It sends a message to the existing residents that the new residents will be more important than them. It creates empty spaces and could create a possible NIMBY dynamic. And lastly, the city is getting developable pads that will be ready for development at no cost, but the city will need to wait years before any new units are built on them. So we're hoping we can count on your support to encourage the city to support the financing of the Treasure Island Affordable Housing Program. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dave Lopez.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. My name is Dave Lopez, and I work with Swords to Plowshares. We've been very fortunate enough to have transitional living programs on Treasure Island since 2001, and we feel exceptionally lucky, I should say, that we are in the first phase. We have recently acquired our gap funding through the Mayor's Office. The Mayor's Office, the Continuum of Care, and the community have done an amazing job at trying to end homelessness among veterans. We're working very, very hard at that. Our concern there is a delay in getting this project off of the ground. It's been many years coming. While we someone who works on the ground every day and is looking to keep residents in San Francisco, I think the 40% is an amazing number to hit. Unfortunately for us, we're having to move many of our residents outside of San Francisco, Alameda County, Contra Costa County, as far as Solano sometimes, because they just cannot afford the rental market here. So we do urge this committee to support our efforts, and we hope that their getting to the 40 will not cause any delays in getting these veterans the affordable housing that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisors. Good afternoon. My name is David Schnur. I'm the Director of Real Estate Development for Community Housing Partnership. Community Housing Partnership supports Supervisor Kim's efforts to bring the greatest possible affordability to Treasure Island. CHP has been operating supportive housing on Treasure Island for formerly homeless families since 2002. And today, among the supportive housing we have across San Francisco, we have 110 units of supportive housing for formerly homeless families on Treasure Island. We're excited to see the reconstruction of the island, so long planned, finally be upon us. And in the many years that this project has been in the planning stages, many factors have changed. Construction costs, as others have commented, have increased while state funding sources have dropped, but state legislation has strengthened infrastructure financing districts and created new tools to create affordable housing. And importantly, rents have skyrocketed, displacing longtime San Franciscans. One thing that hasn't changed is the profound need to create housing for the very most vulnerable families in San Francisco. And indeed, rising costs have made this need even more urgent. So we welcome the opportunity to identify ways to create more affordability on Treasure Island. That effort should address the entire spectrum of households that can't afford San Francisco's exorbitant housing market. This includes, most critically, making certain there's enough money to create the supportive housing for homeless families envisioned in the development agreement, and then as a next step, we should seek to create more opportunities for homeless people to be part of the new Treasure Island. This task force helps us create that opportunity, so we welcome the legislation and we thank Supervisor Kim for introducing it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, directors. My name is Nella Gonsalves, and I'm a division director for Catholic Charities, and I also sit on the Tie-Dye Board of Directors. I've worked for Treasure Island for 16 years, serving families under the Tie-Dye umbrella. I would also like to thank Supervisor Kim for putting a spotlight on the need for funding for the affordable housing program on Treasure Island. As previously stated, the lack of funding support tied to the development schedule is unacceptable and problematic for a number of reasons, but I want to draw attention to the human capital issue. Throughout the years, we have worked really hard to develop and nurture a sense of community with the mixed-use housing model on Treasure Island. On top of that, we've served formerly homeless families for over 16 years and have watched these families overcome great obstacles as they move towards self-sufficiency. To leave them out or put them on the back burner of the development could potentially set these families back by destabilizing their future housing and their family. I hope the board will support the gap financing we need to build this new neighborhood on Treasure Island. To this end, I'm also recommending that members of the Tie-Dye Board of Directors be part of the task force looking at the development of housing on Treasure Island. Thank you for your consideration and support.
Thank you. I have got 4 more cards in front of me. Michael Gobel, Dee Dee Workman, David Meckel, and Fernando Marti. And then after that, if there's anyone else who hasn't filled out the card, you can feel free to come up and speak.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Fernando Marti, co-director of the Council of Community Housing Organizations. I just want to thank and commend Supervisor Kim for putting forth this resolution to study the ways that we can get to greater affordability. I think, as all of you have commented, this is a critical time that we face. And when we talk about getting to 30% or 35% or 40%, it's not just a hashtag. At Treasure Island, we can make a lot better. At Mission Bay, we're building 30%. At Trans Bay, we are building 35%. At the Giant site, we are building 40%, all through development agreements that I believe all of you at some point or another voted in support. Those things were indeed done not just as inclusionary housing, but as a combination of inclusionary and city and tax proceeds that went to making this real. Just to give a comparison, at Treasure Island, what we are talking about right now, the current 25% affordable housing includes 20% that are units that will be built as standalone sites by nonprofits. The other 5% will be inclusionary units. That's a total of 6% of every market rate development will be inclusionary. Now that we are looking at changing our percentage citywide to 25% in every neighborhood, it seems a little odd that a project that is receiving such great amount of city investment will only achieve 25%. We can do better. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of study. And again, thank you, Supervisor Kim, for getting the ball rolling on that.
Thank you, Fernando. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. I'm John Eberling. And I think we need to start with the reality check that the 50% run-up in construction costs in the city in the last 3 years due to the boom is a great challenge, not just for the affordable housing on Treasure Island, but for the entire project. The $1 billion-plus infrastructure budget is certainly going to dramatically grow, and there is not actually a readily identifiable solution to this. When faced with a big problem like that, the practical approach is to break it down into pieces and solve the ones you can, starting with, of course, the first phase. The first step to solve the problem of the deadline to notify the developer of the city's desire to go to 30% by June is necessarily going to be to ask Lennar, the developer, TICD, for an extension of that deadline, at least a year, for the first phase on the Flat Island, on TI itself, and a longer extension for the two following phases that will come over the next 15 to 20 years. That will give you the chance of not having to solve the funding gap for the affordable housing for the entire island at once, which we probably can't do today, but instead solve the funding gap for that initial phase, which we need to get done by 2018, as Sherry said, when Lennar is actually going to start work on delivering those first phase pads. That way, the number that we need to solve for the affordable is much, much less than the entire project would be. So I'm proposing a practical step-by-step approach. I think the developer would be willing to work with the city to realize this, and I think that is where I would urge you to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. My name is Paul Wormer, and I'm fully in support of Supervisor Kim's proposal. We have a problem in the city that's been referred to many times, the lack of housing for those who are not seriously wealthy. What's less often referred to is when you're building market rate housing, you are creating significant additional demand for housing that's affordable to the middle class. And if you're building 25%, you're not even meeting the induced demand, let alone doing anything to add stock to support the middle class or the moderately low income population, the transitional housing. You're not touching that problem in any significant way. There's abundant evidence is building that shows that a strong middle income community is essential for a resilient city. It provides the pathways for children of low income families to move up the economic ladder. We're cutting that out here. And to say, oh, we can really only afford to build for the very wealthy is a problem. And we need strong leadership from the Board of Supervisors to make sure that's not what we're doing. Thank you.
Next speaker, if there are any other speakers that'd like to speak on item 3, please come up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. My name is Sianda Conley. I'm a resident of Treasure Island. I've been on the island for about 11 years. I'm usually pretty long-winded, but I got a lot going on, so I'm just going to keep it simple. I want to really stress the urgency for affordable housing. I just took my kids out about 2 weekends ago to feed the homeless up under Division Street. And my daughter asked me, Mom, could this be us? And I told her, we're 1 mile away. But the way things look on Treasure Island, sometimes we never know whether we're going to be housed out there or not due to this redevelopment. Kind of like what Nella said, we keep building and building, and we don't even trust what the builders say, not like they did in Bayview. They rebuilt it, people moved, they said they could come back, and those families never came back. They had nowhere to live. So I really support what you're doing, Supervisor Jane Kim, and I ask you guys to please support her as well.
Thank you. I just want to, as a clarification, there's been zero displacement for the rebuild of public housing in Bayview Hunters Point. All right. Is there anyone else that'd like to speak on this item? No? Okay. We're going to close public comment at this time. Thank you. All right. Supervisor Kim, do you have any last remarks?
Yes, I just want to thank both the director of TIDA and the TIDA Commission for taking this up. I think we have a real opportunity here to explore all the ways that we can increase affordability in a development that has been entitled and that has been approved. This is one of the largest scale This is the largest scale development here in San Francisco. We have a true opportunity as we build a completely new neighborhood to make sure that we are building as much affordable and middle-income housing as possible. As was mentioned by several members of the public, we're no longer talking about a divide just between the rich and the poor. We're talking about a divide between the ultra-wealthy and everybody else. And we're seeing that in the housing market today. And I think that it is a city priority, and certainly the priority of our residents to make sure that we are investing back into developments, working both in partnership with the private developer, but also with public resources to make sure that we are building as much affordability into the future as possible. I really look forward to working very closely with the task force. I agree that we should have multiple stakeholders, including TIDA, at the table to help us work that out. And I should really just note, I think something that is very unique about this deal is that from the very beginning, the strong commitment to building housing for the formerly homeless. This project is very unique in its commitment to building housing for formerly homeless individuals, veterans, and families. And I'm really proud of the work that TIDA has been able to engage with since 1999 to include organizations like Health Right 360, Community Housing Partnership, Swords to Plowshare, and Catholic Charities to provide housing today for many of our formerly homeless residents, veterans, and families, but also ensuring that there was one-for-one replacement housing in the new development and that we were able to plow in additional affordable housing on top of that. Redevelopment as a tool is something that this entire board has supported even back in 2011 when the governor initially threatened the dissolution of redevelopment. Every single member of this board came out saying that this is an important tool that allows us to build more affordable housing, whether it was in Mission Bay, Hunters Point Shipyard, south of Market, Yerba Buena. This has been an incredibly important tool for us to be able to leverage future property tax dollars that we don't have today and leverage them as a whole, 30 years, 35 years, 40 years of this increment, so that we can build in large masses affordable housing in the current environment. And that is exactly what we need. These are the tools that we want to continue to further explore. And I think as the development evolves, we'll be able to have continuing conversations with the developer as well as with the city. So I just want to thank all the members of the public that came out to speak. I look forward to the future discussions. And I would like to I'd like to ask the committee to make a motion to continue.
I'll make that motion.
To the call of the chair.
Thank you. Motion made and seconded unanimously. This motion passes. Thank you. Supervisor Wiener, did you want to speak, or is that left over?
No.
All right.
Well, actually, so this is just to the call of the chair was the motion.
Supervisor Kim, it's to the call of the chair,
Yeah.
correct? Mr. Clerk, you have that?
Yes, the matter is continued to the call of the chair.
I did want to make a closing
Fantastic.
comment.
Supervisor Wiener.
So no, I want to, and I, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think if we can get any project that we can get up to a higher affordability percentage, that is a good thing. And I think looking into this about what it would take to increase affordability of Treasure Island to we already know what it would take to get it to the 27 or 30%, and just knowing what it would take to get it for 40%, that's a good thing. And then we can make choices based on that. Now, my questioning in this hearing has been just to make crystal clear that we're talking about tax dollars here, not money from the developer, and so we have choices to make about do we increase affordability in Treasure Island, or do we put more money into, say, the small sites acquisition program in the Castro, or in Noe Valley, or in the Mission, or in Western Addition? Do we build more senior housing out in the Sunset? We're making choices. And so with that said, I know that good investigation will come here, and it may be that it's more cost effective when you're already building an entire new neighborhood to plow our tax dollars into that project to buy up a higher percentage of affordable. That might be the most cost-effective way to quickly deliver affordable housing, and if it is, that could be a great use of these funds. Or there might be another use. So I'm glad we've had this conversation today, and thank you very much, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you.
Chair Cohen, through the chair, just one more comment. I just want to ask that in the the next hearing that we do get a report from both our Director of Mayor's Office of Housing Community Development, Olson Lee, who's in the room today, and our Director, Bob Beck. And I should emphasize, I do believe in geographic equity in terms of affordable housing. And if we know that there's a project in the Sunset or in Noe Valley where we are already committed to building affordable housing, I am happy to vote for general fund dollars to be used to build affordable housing there. But we know that we have housing here on Treasure Island. We know that we have the support of the commission and of that neighborhood to build more affordable housing. So we got to build where we know that we can actually do it.
Thank you, Supervisor Kim. Mr. Clerk, we voted on this measure. Could you please call the next item? I believe it's item number 6.
Next on the agenda, item number 6, hearing to review student housing needs and production, including number of full-time students in the city and projections for future enrollment, numbers of student housing units currently available, catalog of new student housing projects in the pipeline, challenges that affect the production of student housing, and recommendations on process and legislation improvements.
Thank you. Thank you. So Supervisor Wiener is the author of this item. I'll now turn the hearing over to him.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Colleagues, this hearing today is to receive a status update from our city departments and also from several universities about how we're doing in terms of building, creating student housing in San Francisco. Providing housing for students is a critical part of addressing both our housing affordability needs as well as ensuring that our local institutions of higher learning succeed and can attract the very, very best students and attract students here who are actually able to live in our city. We have tens of thousands of higher education students, both college and earning advanced degrees in San Francisco. I believe it pushes 100,000. However, we have never built nearly enough student housing in San Francisco to account for these students and their housing needs. Students have different needs than families and longer-term residents, yet due to our lack of student housing production, these students are frequently basically tossed into our general housing pool to compete against the broader population, which drives up housing costs. It's not good for the students. It's not good for the broader population of San Francisco. These students could easily be housed in dorms or other forms of student housing instead of crowding into our already crowded housing market here in San Francisco. We know that this lack of student housing has also incentivized violations of the law, frankly, in terms of universities, or one in particular, swallowing up our buildings in our rent-controlled housing stock and converting them from general-purpose housing into student dorms. We don't want to see that. We want to see new, specific student housing being built for our students. Too many students are having to either crowd into overcrowded apartments or commute in from long distances, either driving or having to take transit for a long distance every single day. We also see too many students who even live in their cars, and we want to make sure that we have student housing for these students. So we need to find more and more ways to create that housing. In 2012, colleagues, I authored student housing legislation that created incentives and exemptions for universities building student housing to make it easier and less expensive for them to build their own student housing, to make sure that when they are doing that student housing development, they can maximize the number of units that they put in those buildings to make it more cost-effective and to produce more student housing. Around the same time, I also authored the so-called micro-unit legislation, allowing for smaller studios in San Francisco. And even though that was a topic of extensive debate, some were claiming that we were going to make every housing unit in San Francisco a micro-unit, which of course could not be further from the truth. We know that our strongest advocates in that legislation were affordable housing developers and also universities, because micro-units are terrific options for student housing. So today we're going to hear from the Planning Department, and then from 4 different universities, UCSF, UC Hastings, San Francisco State, and California College of the Arts, to hear about what they're doing, what they're planning. And we're also very interested in hearing ideas for how we can make it even easier for universities to create student housing. Colleagues, if there are no preliminary comments, Supervisor Peskin, and thank you for your work on this issue as well. I'd like to start by asking Anne Marie Rogers from the Planning Department to provide an update.
Thank you very much, Supervisors. I'm Anne Marie Rogers. Got some handouts for the public and for the supervisors of this presentation today. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor, and I'd like to thank the committee for inviting us here to talk about the student housing issue. My presentation is going to cover 4 different items today. First, the form of student housing. Second, the need for this housing type in San Francisco. Third, some of our local policy and land use law around student housing, and some recent as well as pending student housing projects that we have in our pipeline. So first, the form of student housing. Student housing once brought to mind a traditional on-campus dorm-type room. Now, housing associated with colleges may be either on campus or off, and it may take numerous forms. It could be a dorm, or it could be an apartment with a kitchen, or some other group housing-like arrangement. So second, let's talk about the need for student housing. The city, as we all know, has an overall housing crisis. Everyone agrees about that. Colleges and universities draw students to the city who may be low income and who will be competing with other residents to find housing. We have approximately 30 such institutions in the city with about 80,000 students in total. And while some of the students may already live in San Francisco, we can estimate that at least 40,000 beds are needed. Currently, colleges provide only about 9,000 beds. Third, I'm going to provide a short overview of our existing policy and land use law. Our general plan says that new commercial developments and higher educational institutions should help meet the housing demand they generate, especially for low-income workers and students. Since 2010, the city has passed a couple of important laws regarding student housing. The intent of these legislative changes has always been twofold. First and foremost, to encourage the production of student housing, and second, but equally important, is to protect our existing housing stock. With these goals in mind, the first ordinance removed the inclusionary requirement from student housing. Other housing projects not dedicated to students are required to pay the inclusionary housing fee or are required to provide these units as part of their project. Student housing is now exempted from this requirement. And as this inclusionary requirement is the largest impact fee in San Francisco, removing this fee offers a significant fiscal incentive to build more student housing. The 2010 ordinance paired this significant incentive with a provision that prevented the conversion of our existing housing stock to student housing. Again, to truly get this new housing built, this law sought to prevent the conversion of this existing housing to student housing. And during the hearings, this undesirable outcome was called the cannibalization of our existing housing stock. Prohibiting the conversion eliminated this concern. Oops. Now let's go on to the second law, the 2010 law that Supervisor Wiener introduced. This law sought to expand on these goals by increasing the effectiveness of the law, easing compliance, and providing some exemptions to maximize housing produced. The original law had a burdensome requirement. It required annual reports on the incomes of specific people living in the student housing. The 2010 12 law changed the reporting requirement to continue to ensure a diverse student body, but without requiring reports on specific individuals' incomes. Under the new law, instead of each development documenting that 30% of the students living there were low income, the Associated Educational Institute must document that 30% of their overall student body is low income. This law also established student housing type as a use type so it could be tracked and regulated effectively. The law established a mechanism to recapture inclusionary fees if the project should ever convert to a standard residential use in the future. And importantly, it continued the prohibition on the conversion of existing housing to student housing. So here's the definition that resulted. This is today's definition. It allows for flexible housing types, group housing, dwelling units with kitchens, or SORO-styled units, really anything owned or operated by an educational use. And student housing is permitted in any zoning district where the underlying dwelling type is permitted, because student housing can be all those different types, group housing or dwelling units. So lastly, here are some specific developments in San Francisco that we have seen recently built and some that we may see in the future. Under this latest law, we have seen the production of about 450 new beds of student housing, and through a remodel of the existing San Francisco State dorms, about 800 new beds were recently added to that campus. More beds are also in the pipeline to be considered for future approvals. The department has applications for about 1,700 new beds currently under review. These are associated with these 4 projects. So really, no presentation on student housing would be complete without a discussion of the one institution that has provided housing without benefit of permits. At the Government Audit and Oversight Committee, as they heard last month, planning staff described the Academy of Art University and their submitted permit applications, including an amendment to the planning code. If approved, these applications would legalize about 1,800 existing beds. So San Francisco has seen an increase in the production of student housing. Still, given the estimate that the city needs about 40,000 student beds, and given that we had about 9,000 beds, even with the recent production increase, and even assuming that all of the pipeline projects would be approved and provide another 3,000 beds, San Francisco would still have a significant shortfall of housing for our existing students of around 28,000 beds. Again, thank you for inviting us here to talk to you about student housing. We welcome your attention to this issue.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rogers. We now have, 4 different universities who will be providing us with updates. Well, let's start with UCSF, Claire Schenerl, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor of Campus Life Services.
While we're getting set up, I'd just like to say that I collaborated with 2 other public institutions that are here today. So David Seward, who's the Chief Financial Officer of Hastings, is here with me and will present right after me, as well as Dr. Hong and Thomas Lolini from San Francisco State. And the first slide, we put together a matrix so that you could see our current inventory along with our planned, and we'll go through these in our specific presentations. So just one second while we get our AV straight. Actually, maybe what I'll do, just to respect everybody's time, since there's 3 of us that use similar alphabets in our names, I thought I would take a minute to describe UC San Francisco, the institution I'm representing right now. We're one of 10 campuses of the UC system, a public education system. And one thing that distinguishes us from most other schools is that we're graduate level only and focus exclusively on the health sciences. So we don't have any undergrads. We're a fairly small campus. We're a fairly small campus in terms of student size. And so you'll see here our numbers that we have 6,390 students and trainees. Today I'm going to use the word trainee a lot because we have a lot of medical residents and fellows who are graduated but still in residency and training. So we regroup them together. We are a very large employer here in San Francisco, employing about 24,000 staff and faculty. We're a very big economic engine, generating about 39,000 jobs and producing about $6.2 billion in economic impact. We also consider ourselves, and are documented so, as providing a huge amount of health care here in the city and beyond. So let me talk a little bit about the high cost of housing and the impact here at UCSF. Rising housing costs are huge drivers in our rising graduate and professional student debt. You can see here that our average student just 4 years ago graduated with $116,000 of debt, and that's now gone to $140,000, and almost all of that is attributed to the rising cost of their housing. It's really hard for us to keep pace with some of the private institutions that are admitting and competing with us for the very best graduate students and trainees, including Stanford and Harvard, and that's largely because they have very large endowments and can offer grants and other types of financial aid that we cannot. We're also challenged because we're very limited in the amount of housing, so that is hard for us to compete against other schools like Cornell and Columbia that have very, very large inventories. So let me take you now to kind of what the demand looks like for housing amongst our students and trainees, and it's really soaring, and all of it correlates with the rising cost for off-campus housing. So our rentals are about 40% below market right now. And if you look at two indicators of demand, one is the level of rejection in our applications. So in 2011, not that long ago, we were already rejecting 54%. We're now up to rejecting 62%. So the balance of these students are really struggling in the market to find a reasonably priced housing. We also just conducted a demand study of our students and trainees, and we're showing that just a year ago, 51% wanted housing, and now it's climbing to 61%. We'll measure it again in a year, but that's the trend that we're seeing. We're really able to only accommodate about 14% of our students and 14% of our trainees. It's a very small percentage. So this puts our estimated shortfall of about 1,200 and 1,500 units just for our students, and we haven't even addressed other populations like our junior faculty and our staff. The shortfall is really reaching a dire state at UCSF. It's impeding our recruitment, it's threatening our retention, and I'm talking today about students and trainees, but it's really impacting all of our populations. And our Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, Stan Lowenstein, one of our pristine physicians as well, really summed it up nicely. And he says, for UCSF, the greatest current threat to our excellence is the high cost of living in our community. UCSF's success in life science, research, education, and patient care has been what attracts the best, most passionate, and bright students, staff, and faculty. But we're losing talent at all levels, in all segments of our community. So here are some of the goals that we have. One is to increase inventory and keep housing costs well below market. Just as a point of reference, UCSF rental rates for students in a one-bedroom is on average $2,300 a month. That's the current academic year that we're in. We typically only increase our rates by 4% annually. That's a goal that we have, even when considering adding on additional development. We're really busy quantifying the problem. We're measuring demand for campus housing among all of our populations, identifying locations where we could develop on campus, and identifying the type of unit typology or mix that would accommodate this demand. While all of our population needs housing, we've prioritized it for students and trainees now. They're in biggest need, but we also have huge demand from our junior faculty and from other populations. This is a list of our forecasted planned projects in housing. The most soon forthcoming one is on Minnesota Street in the Dogpatch neighborhood, scheduled for 2019. I won't read all these, but I want to point out that we don't have anything coming online anytime soon. I would like to show you a graph, though, that shows you our supply and demand. So the red line that you see is our planned number of units, and the orange and the yellow lines are where we're targeting to reach, and you can see the huge shortfall that we have right now with that very, very large delta. But it's going to get better over time. So, excuse me, this is the Minnesota project, and then our Deer colleagues at Hastings have invited us to share on a housing project that I know David Seward will address. So that is going to have enormous positive impact on our inventory, and there you can see how that takes us up to where we want to be, but unfortunately not until 2035. Actually, I would say with Hastings in 2025 we'll be where we need to be. So as I said before, our biggest problem is right now, we call the students and trainees who are at UCSF right now the sandwich generation, because we don't have a solution for them. We did look at several off-campus options to help fill the short-term demand. We looked at master leasing. We looked at purchasing completed inventory. None of them were feasible, largely because of extremely high costs, but I'll also point out that it is our preference and objective to develop our own housing so that we don't adversely impact the limited amount of housing available here in San Francisco. I do also want to point out that one of the other distinguishing characteristics about UCSF is the fact that our students and trainees need to be very close to campus. They're on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They need proximity to the labs and to their patients and to their clinics. So they don't really have the option of living very far away, not to mention that also adds a lot to their commuter costs. So that is the end of the UC San Francisco presentation.
Can I just ask
Sure.
a question? One question that I will ask of all the universities. One thing I'm interested in, and maybe at the end planning can come back up, is whether there's anything else we can be doing in terms of legislation to try to spur more student housing. I know that UCSF, like SF State, has in certain aspects its sovereign immunity and isn't always subject to some of the restrictions in the city, but I know that CCA does not have that sovereign immunity, and obviously other universities do not. So that's one question, anything that we can be doing better or more efficiently or better legislation. And the other thing is specific to UC and UCSF and SF State is, for UCSF, do the regents, does the UC system, how do they in any way address the fact that I'm not saying that San Francisco is unique in terms of housing costs. Obviously, Berkeley is very expensive, and LA, and at least in certain areas, is very expensive. But clearly, compared to some of the other UC campuses, this is off the charts. Does the UC system as a whole take that in any way into account?
Well, they've just established a task force to review this, and we met with UCOP last week. So they're looking at student and trainee housing for all of the UC campuses. So yeah, we are unique in that we are the most expensive market, but you're absolutely right that Berkeley and LA are not far behind. So we are meeting with them. They're looking for ways to help as well.
Do you think there's any prospect of the regents actually providing some sort of meaningful approach in terms of cost of living differentials in the various campuses, and the need for UCSF and Hastings as well to maybe provide more support from the regions, understanding that they have their own budget major challenges?
So housing across the UC system is entirely self-supporting. Therefore, we do not receive any funds other than what's generated from the rents. So it would be new for UCOP or any core funds to pay for any aspects of housing. So most of the things that we're working with them are they have a lot of requirements for every piece of construction, requires a lot of review, so they're looking to see if they can accelerate or combine some of their steps, or maybe change some of the way that they calculate their financing, but not actual funds.
Thank you.
Thank you, members of the committee. My name is David Seward. I'm with the University of California Hastings College of Law. And as Claire mentioned, we are working on a collaboration with UCSF to address this critical need. Both UC Hastings and UCSF face a critical housing shortage. We have entered into a letter of intent.
Could you speak directly into the microphone? Thanks.
We have entered into a letter of intent with UCSF back in December to jointly explore and collaborate on the development of additional student housing. We already have a business relationship with UCSF as well as an academic relationship that we're hoping to leverage upon. Now, a little bit about UC Hastings, since notwithstanding the UC label, we do have a unique relationship with the University of California system. We are not under the auspices of the Regents. We have a board of directors, but we face sort of the same issues that UCSF does as well. And to your point, Mr. Weiner, the funding student housing in the public sector is extremely challenging because of the provisions that my colleague was referring to, that these projects be self-supporting. There is no state funding provided to support student housing. Under the Master Plan for Higher Education, all of these projects must be self-supporting. And when Claire refers to core funds, that means the universities cannot pledge student fees. We cannot pledge state appropriations. The economics of these projects need to lend themselves to a housing project with rent levels that are truly manageable by students. Hastings also is a total professional school setting. We have no undergraduate population. Our students are all, age over 21, professional school students. They finance their education through debt. I mean, that's just the sad fact of the matter. We have many Hastings students here today, along with UCSF as well. Like UCSF, our average debt for each student carrying debt is about $136,000. 85% of our student body has some form of financial aid. So as opposed to a sort of a setting where there's additional parental support, our students are independent and self-supporting. So the development of student housing is really critical if we're to preserve our mission of providing public education, removing financial barriers to access that would otherwise exist. If we are successful in pulling off this project, we will be able to save students roughly $43,000 over the course of 3 years in rent. And that's being the difference of the median one-bed cost $3,000 and what we can provide the housing at.
And are you, I know UCSF has indicated, and I know the chancellor has actually said to me that they're losing residents to other programs because of the cost of housing. I'm guessing the answer is probably yes, but are you seeing prospective sort of really, some of the best of the best law school applicants choosing other universities because of the cost of housing?
Students weigh the cost of attendance with the school's location, with the school's ranking. And all professional schools in the UC system are in extremely competitive environments. We compete with UC Davis. UC Davis, we have the same tuition levels, roughly. And all of our tuitions, another constraint, have been capped for the past 4 or 5 years by virtue of the Governor Brown's direction. So yes, we are competing with other schools that can provide good education. UC Davis is a good school. We're a better school, but good education at a lower cost. And students nowadays are extremely cost-conscious and debt-averse. I mean, I think that's been, in some respects, a positive byproduct of the Great Depression, recession of 2008, 2009. People care about debt. So if you're a student who's looking at choices that you can go to, you look at UC Hastings, a great school, great location. They're waiting till the last minute to make a final decision. They start going to Craigslist, because that's where most of our housing is provided by. We're fortunate we can house 30% of our students today. But that other 70% cohort go to Craigslist, they look at the rents, they have heart attacks. Some students make other choices because of that cost. We have a very strong diversity level. Many of our students are first generation law school, professional school, graduate school. Many of the communities where our students come from have a deeply rooted debt aversion that I think is commendable. So the answer is yes. So in terms of where we're going with student housing, we want to develop more. We're partnering with UCSF. Our campus has the benefit of being pretty much physically epicenter to the various far-flung outposts that UCSF manages and controls, primarily Parnassus Heights, Mission Bay, General Hospital, and Mount Zion. So in terms of a collaboration, we're very well suited for each other. Our students are similar. What we're talking about and planning on is not just shared student housing, but sharing our entire campus. So when we talk about having a collaborative relationship with UCSF, we're talking about sharing our library, our social spaces, our amenities, providing access to the entire campus and treating them just like as if though they were a UC Hastings student. We are commingling the populations, and we're also expanding that concept to other areas of the academic program. So this is a very exciting opportunity for both of our institutions to create additional vibrancy in the Tenderloin Civic Center neighborhood that we reside in, to support small businesses, to support positive growth, positive change that's non-displacement, non-gentrifying, and supports our public mission as the California segment of higher education. So as you see, our campus runs up and down McAllister Street in a east-west access. Our current student housing facility was built in 1928. It is in need of substantial upgrade and modernization, not the least of which is a seismic upgrade. We are looking at putting in the new student housing at the site of the 198 McAllister building. The state of California has appropriated $37 million for us to build a new academic building on Golden Gate Avenue. So our plan is, upon the completion of the academic building at 333 Golden Gate, to go in and develop additional student housing capacity at the site of the old academic building at 198 McAllister. Upon completion of that project, empty out 100 McAllister, built in 1928 again, and effectuate top-to-bottom rehabilitations of that building. So we are talking a significant amount of housing, between 780 to 1,100 new units, rehabilitating 250 existing units, and it will make a huge dent, at least in the professional school realm. We have also reached out to our colleagues at San Francisco State University to see whether they too would be interested in signing on for our graduate student village concept, because we really are talking about creating a graduate student village where San Francisco State MBA students, public policy, can collaborate, live with, work with students from UCSF as well as UC Hastings. So with that, any questions? And otherwise, I'll hand it over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
While she's getting that up, just want to thank the board for the opportunity to speak to you on this important issue, and we look forward to the opportunity to partner with you on this. My name's Lola Hong, and I'm the Vice President for Student Affairs and Enrollment Management, just finishing up almost on my second year. Associate Vice President Tom Lolini is actually going to be presenting with me. I'm going to address more the broader overview about our students and the residential life significance of housing on our campus, and then AVP Lolini will address more of the facilities-related issues. So San Francisco State is one of the 23 campuses of the California State University system. The system really prides itself on combining both access and excellence for the students that we serve all across the state of California. SF State is also one of the largest campuses in the system. I'm trying to keep talking as we get the presentation up. Okay, the importance of housing cannot be understated to the academic success of our students. We broke this out into 3 buckets. First of all, it's really critical that we have sufficient housing to facilitate access to higher education, and we wanted to operationalize it in 3 ways. We talked about the importance of affordability. I'd like to share that for our incoming freshman class, nearly half of our students are eligible to receive a Pell Grant. The receipt of a Pell Grant is really a proxy to determine the fact that these are our neediest students. So these are students whose families can make the least amount of expected family contribution to the cost of higher education. And the fact that we have such a high proportion of students who are eligible really signals the fact that we do serve a high number of low-income families. The other trend that we are seeing, which has been very notable in the last 5 years in particular, is the increase of demand for San Francisco State University as a destination campus. And we're seeing a decrease in the percentage of students from the Bay Area who are applying and entering as freshmen, and an increase in students from Southern California.
And what is that percentage? We don't have the PowerPoint, so I can't really read it. Can you just tell
Sorry,
us?
it's 28% of first-time freshmen are from Southern California, and then 47% are Pell Grant eligible. Sorry about that.
And what, compared to what it was, say, 20, 30 years ago?
20, 30 years ago, I'm going to say we were almost predominantly from the Bay Area. The campus really was a commuter campus, if you will, and so it was prohibitive for students to be coming from further away. So this is a definite change for the campus. And then, as noted earlier, it is important to note that we are able to provide a total experience at a reduced cost for our students. And so the latest data, I think, for 2016 is an average one-bedroom in San Francisco is just over $3,000. And while we recognize $3,000 a month, while we recognize it's not quite apples to apples, the reality of it is when students calculate and do the math, there is something to be said about living on campus where we can provide beds on average from just over $800 to $1,200 a month for that 10-month period when they are in school. So there is a savings for them. We also know that housing can provide an important role in the retention of students. We want to make sure that our students get through college and not just get in. And so because we serve, like many of our colleagues talked about, a high proportion of first-generation, low-income, and students of color, it really is important that we help them stay in school. Residential life programs that are effective can actually have a very significant impact on improving the retention rates if you have enough beds, right? So if there are not enough beds, you actually can't have that effect. And we know that reducing commute time and other similar barriers can also have a positive effect in helping students stay in school, be able to attend class. And the other reason why it's important that universities play an active role in providing student housing is we can provide what we call the developmental spectrum of housing options. We don't think first-time freshmen who are 17 or 18 years old should come in and live in an apartment unit with 6 other people making their own food. We want them to get out and engage with the community, meet with their professors, socialize with other students. And so the ability for us to build housing that caters specifically to college students, like that traditional double-loaded corridor, and build community is really important to their success. And then lastly, we really want to contribute to the graduation of our students. The CSU has an overall graduation initiative. At SF State, we'd like to get our graduation rates to 65% within 6 years by the year 2025. I'm happy to report that we're headed in the right direction. We've already increased our graduation rate by about 2% from last year's cohort to this year's cohort, and we topped the 50% mark, which is really important. The last thing that I wanted to share about the graduation is that many of our grads, 80%, stay in the Bay Area after they graduate from SF State. So they are an important part of the sustainability of our workforce and our economic engine here in the Bay Area. So just some quick statistics. Right now we have capacity to house just over 4,000 students. This represents about 14% of our total, just approximately 30,000 headcount. Our current occupancy right now is 98%, and our peak wait list, while it wavers, this last year was really high. We had way more students apply than we were able to house, and it was at 2,000. We actually cap it at 2,000 because we know that we can't meet the need.
And that 14%, how does that compare to other CSU campuses? If you know?
We're probably right in the middle of the pack. The Carnegie Foundation defines that a residential campus is 20 to 25% of undergraduate students. So this is a little bit higher if you just take undergrad, and so we definitely want to creep that number up. The housing piece we feel is really tied to the mass transit and sustainability of our environment as well. And so this is actually from a transportation survey that was done at SF State just 2 years ago in 2014. So by the way, these numbers don't add up to 100 because what this represents are all the modes that students indicate that they take to ultimately arrive on campus. And so you can see that we have a proportion who bike in. Muni is extremely popular, just under half of our students. We have a lot of walkers. We still have a significant number of individuals who are driving alone. But these are all the different ways that students are arriving onto campus to be able to take class, do their student employment, et cetera, participate in co-curricular activities. Obviously, a shift in housing footprint will have an impact on this as well. A little bit about our students who are living on campus. You can see that the vast majority are in that 18 to 20-year range. And we have a majority of freshmen living on campus. The challenge we have is because we don't have a sufficient bed space, that as they go through their time here at SF State, we're not able to accommodate all of the student demand should they wish to stay on. And then again, to just emphasize our diversity, 70% of our students living in our residence halls are students of color. And so that is important that we provide accessible, affordable housing. Here's just another way to think about our students who are living on campus. So of the students who live on campus, the largest chunk is accounted for by people who are from California but not from the Bay Area. So that speaks to the accessibility issue, 62%. Then we have 21% who are from the Bay Area, 3.4% who are from other countries, our international students, and then about 13.3% who come from outside of the state. Turn it over now to AVP Lolini.
Thank you. So my name is Tom Lolini. I'm the Senior Associate Vice President for Physical Planning and Development at San Francisco State. I've been at the campus now about 8 months. One of the reasons I came is in part because the position involves running student housing and dining services in addition to sort of managing facilities and development. A little higher? How's this? Better? So I'm just going to show you a couple of little planning slides that we've been working on, trying to take a hard look at this issue of student access, recruitment, and retention, and the role that housing plays in it. You know where San Francisco State is, I presume. This is where it shows up on the map. But it is one of the areas that's been identified for the Housing Density Bonus Program by being studied by the San Francisco Planning Department. This slide indicates a couple of things. One is that we have been trying to increase supply within the existing housing stock by tripling or doubling rooms that maybe didn't have that kind of density of student occupancy before, by making the apartments furnished rather than unfurnished and making it simpler to get students in and get them out. But even though we had a 13% increase in our supply, we realized a significant increase in our demand by about 40%. So the wait list actually peaked last summer when all deposits were taken into account to almost 2,500 on top of the, we usually try to cap it about 2,000, but this past summer we showed a very intense increase. In fact, that wait list increased 132% year over year. So we started to try and map where do San Francisco State students live, and in addition to how do they get to campus. And you'll see here in this sort of GIS distribution model, the big red circle indicates about a 1.5-hour transit commute and a 1-hour automobile commute. While 50% of our students live in San Francisco, the other 50% live in parts far, right? And this shows that distribution with about a quarter of them in the East Bay and a quarter of them in the South Bay. When you look at San Francisco itself, of the 49% of our students that live in the city, about 76% of them live on campus. So the one thing about building on campus that has great advantages, both to the campus and to the community with respect to the burden on the transportation systems, is that we are very well served by transit. We're served by BART plus the San Francisco Shuttle, by the Muni M line. It may ultimately involve the J line as the planning goes forward under SFMTA's subway study. And then we've got about 4 or 5 bus lines that serve the campus as well as Samtrans. So it's a very accessible campus by virtue of transit. To the extent that you build housing on campus, you're actually reducing the burden on the transportation system because those are students that aren't commuting. And finally, what are we doing now? So we have a project called the Holloway Public-Private Partnership that is currently in the process of reviewing proposals from developers that may generate anywhere from 250 to an additional 450 beds of student housing in the next few years. We are currently under construction on a wellness center that will improve the social life of students who do reside on campus and their access to recreation. And we are now undertaking studies both in the northern area and the southern flanks of campus to look at how redevelopment over time could yield as many as 6,000 to 8,000 additional units of student housing. And that would get us up to a more present goal of looking toward housing 40 to 50% of our students. And that's my conclusion. If you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer.
I'm sorry, what's the timetable?
We are just developing those studies now. So the timetable for the Holloway project is that it might be occupied by 2018. That's the 250 to 450 beds. But we're looking at an aggressive timetable to bring forward this other planning effort, hoping to realize housing within the next 3 to 4 years. Now, it would have to be phased for absorption because of the volume, but it's something that that's part of the studying that we're doing now. It's just how fast we can move it.
Right, and the 14, if it's currently at 14% in terms of the percentage of students in student housing, what percentage?
So
I mean, I know there's still a process, but what percentage would you like to see it go
Yeah,
up
so
to?
the goal would be somewhere in the 40 to 50% range.
Okay.
That's basically the target, and that's what generates those numbers. And that's looking at our full-time student equivalent. We actually have 30,000 students almost.
Part-timers. Yeah.
But a lot of those are part-time, and they'll stay part-time, no doubt. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And same question with CSU. Is that as part of the master plan, CSU also requires that that it be self-sustaining?
Yes, absolutely. It has to be self-sustaining. Right.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
To what do you attribute, or your colleagues discuss, the shift over the last generation from State being a commuter campus to most of its students actually coming from outside of San Francisco and the Bay Area? To what do you attribute that?
I would say...
Other than that, we're the best city in the world?
Yeah. I could respond sort of in three ways, and I'll let Lolo speak to it as well. But part of it is that the extreme growth in college-age population has made the CSU system a higher, more competitive system for access. Secondly, the retention and matriculation and graduation rates have become very important. They're realizing the connection to student housing is a very key part of that.
I'm going to add that it's technology. I think social media and the internet have allowed students to be a little bit more discerning about their institutional type, and there's both a push and a pull. So we're seeing that other parts of California are now also more likely to pull students from San Francisco. Students are looking for that match, and I think there is a distinct institutional type. There's a story about what SF State stands for, that for students who are from Southern California who are looking for that, the more activist, the more emphasis on sustainability and similar types of values, are going to then say, that's the institution where I would go. And I think the internet has really facilitated that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Now, I guess, CCA, David Meckel.
That's it. Yeah, thank you. Very overqualified tech here. Thank you, Supervisor. Well, I'm happy to share with you, as probably the smallest school here, unless somebody's here from the Conservatory of Music, I think we're the smallest. CCA, for those of you who don't know, we're a private nonprofit art and design school. 2,000 students, 1,500 undergraduate, 500 graduate, 108 years old, and this image is of our campus at the base of Potrero Hill. We've been busy right from the get-go on let's see, so I'm not a Mac. Oh, there we go. On working on this issue with you, Supervisor, and others, and we've all seen these numbers of the shortfall, and I think early on, as with the other schools, we thought it was our responsibility to provide 50% of our students with housing if we could figure out how to do it. With the help of the SF Hack and Tim Colin, and hosted by Dave at Hastings, we had 3 curated conversations that brought the planning department, the developers, and the schools together. And that, of course, led to the 3 pieces of legislation that were discussed. And we were able to get a project underway even before the 3rd piece of legislation was underway, and that's the panoramic, which is at 9th and Mission. And just to give you a little idea of how long these things take, this shows the timeline we did this in, the developers in the room, and I think he will speak during the speaker portion. This building opened in August 2015. It's an 11-story poured-in-place concrete building at 9th and Mission, 5 floors of CCA students, 200 beds, 5 floors of Conservatory of Music students, 200 beds, Steinway in the lobby. The thing's green as all get out. There's no parking. There are 400 indoor parking spots for bicycle, 1 per bed. Great music in the lobby, good presence on Mission Street. The plan basically pushes suites to the corners and micro units on the inboard side, and is packed with various sustainability and wellness features. Each student's unit, the water, both hot and cold, is digitally monitored so the students can watch what's going on. It's an amazing building. It's really fantastic if you haven't been there. It's based on, this is one of the micro units, it's based on a unit that has a full-size bathroom with a full ADA complement, and then houses 2 students, but it also has, this is an actual photograph, it also has full-on kitchen in the unit. So it's got dishwasher, microwave, fridge, cooktop, etc.
I'm sorry, how many square feet is the total unit?
Patrick, 270 for the studios and 524 for the suites. Yeah, 270 for the studios, 524 for suites. This, it has operable windows, but these are double glazed, and you can keep them closed because below the window seat in the bay window is a HEPA filter that changes the air every hour on the hour. So as Patrick likes to say, you can cook curry in here and an hour later not smell it. So it's got an amazing roof deck that looks over to one side at Twitter's headquarters, to the other at South of Market and around the rest of the city. There's barbecue facilities on the roof, and there it is from the corner. We also, back at our campus, we're busy with Supervisor Cohn a few years back getting a special use district, which embedded student housing within the special use district. So I'm happy to say that in addition to this completed project, we have 2 other projects that are in the planning department. So the yellow represents our special use district. And I'm going to give you copies of this because it's impossible to read on screen, but this is our kind of housing strategy. And basically what you'll see this calls out for is off-campus housing, near-campus housing, and on-campus housing. The panoramic, which I showed you, satisfies our off-campus housing. It's a mile away. It's right on transit, right next to the emerging mid-market district. The near-campus housing is in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. That's 75 Arkansas with a private developer. That's 230 beds, apartment style, large units, 4-bedroom units. And that went in for a PPA in last July. And then the last project we have in planning at the moment is the one called Hooper on this slide, which will be about 500 first-time freshman units right on campus, and the PPA for that went in first week of February. One of the things I did want to, because Supervisor Wiener, you had asked us this, what are some of the challenges here. And one of the big things for us is timing. If you're a developer, you can build an apartment project like the Daggett Triangle down there, and whenever you get done, you can throw a leasing office up and rent it. If you are student housing, first of all, we have to package all the way they apply, their financial aid. We need like 15 months to market it, and then we get 3 days to fill it. Right? We got to hit those 3 days, or we have to wait a whole nother year. So one of the challenges in student housing is getting the planning timeline and the occupation timeline to align. And so I looked at our...
And when you say planning, do you mean the overall planning, or planning having to do with the planning department, or...
No, I mean just the process of going through the planning department. Yeah. And I'll show you, for instance, this is our 75 Arkansas timeline. I just picked off the developer's list every time they were moving through there. And so we just have to kind of reverse engineer to make sure this hits. If it hits a month late, it doesn't work for us. So I guess what I would ask, and you may hear this from the developers who talk, is that we talk about this early in the planning process, because it is not fungible. You miss that date and you're screwed for another year. So that's it. I will say the project I showed you, the panoramic, those beds rent at least 40% below market. They filled like that. We have demand, as all these other schools do. And it's been such a phenomenal boost to building our community. We had typically were able to house freshman students only, but now we can house sophomores. And to be able to have that living, learning community continue is great.
And I'm sorry, remind me, what is your student body?
2,000 total.
And how many do you house in student housing?
Currently house 500. We're going to 1,000.
To 1,000, great. And in terms of, how do you price the units for the
So we price across all our different housing types. We don't necessarily just do a pass-through, but on the panoramic, the Patrick Kennedy, the developer we worked with, was able to both acquire the site and deliver a very efficient building, and we were able to price that quite low. So the numbers you've heard, the magic numbers to get somewhere between 800 and 1,200 a bed. If you can hit in that zone, students can make it work. If you can't hit in that zone, they're going to go out in the market and take family housing off.
And so do you, so you're master leasing entirely or only partially?
We lease half the building, master lease half the building. Conservatory music, master lease is the other half.
Okay, and so, but I mean, in terms of the student housing for CCA, it's all master lease.
It is, yes.
And do you provide any subsidy? So whatever you're paying to the owner, do you just pass that through 100% to the student, or is there
No, obviously we have live-in staff. We have to add some other things on to operate it.
Right.
In other words, the developer covers the base building operation, but we have RAs and staff and others.
But for the students, I mean, so if you're paying the owner, say, $1,200 a month, do you just pass that through to the student?
No, because the other thing we do is take across all our housing types, and we moderate the more expensive ones down with the ones we already own and have a lower basis in. And so we're pricing below market across all our housing. And as with most of the other schools, 80% of our students are on need-based aid. So you're basically trying to package this as an affordable housing product.
And in terms of, you said that the Panoramic project was 40% below market. Is that 40% in terms of what you're paying through the master lease, or what the students are paying?
No, what the students are paying is what they could go out and get.
Okay. And in terms of what's causing it to be 40% below market, what's your take on that?
A brilliant developer, as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Okay.
And the legislation, to be honest with you, right? Because it wouldn't have been able to get there without it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And can I just ask SFG TV to come back to the hearing. That slide's been sitting up there for a while, so the public can't see who's speaking. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I believe that's the end of the university presentations. So I want to really appreciate and thank the universities for coming out today, taking the time to put together a really thoughtful presentation and to, I think, provide some really useful information. I think a lot of people, unless you're really thinking about it, may not realize how many students we have, how few students have access to dorms, and how difficult an issue this really is. It's a huge, huge issue. Okay, at this point we'll open it up to public comment, unless Supervisor Peskin, was that an additional comment? Okay. So I will call our public comment cards, Madam Chair, if that's okay. Okay. Dee Dee Workman, Sonia Arndt, Chris Ballard, Samuel Chang, Vincent Moita, Tim Colin, Patrick Kennedy, and Tom Radulovich.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Dee Dee Workman from the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. We want to thank you, Supervisor Wiener, for holding this hearing and for your 2012 legislation as well, for your recognition of the lack of sufficient student housing in San Francisco and your attempt to continue to focus attention on it and find solutions for it. I have a college-age student myself, born and raised in San Francisco, so this is a conversation we have in our house all the time. With him and his friends. They cannot find housing here in the city when they're in school here. There's insufficient housing being provided by the schools. When they go out into the open market, the property owners often don't want to rent to students. I mean, that's the catch-22. I mean, sometimes they're taking family housing off the market because there's a whole bunch of them. The only way they can afford to live is for a whole bunch of them to take the larger spaces with more bedrooms. But they also find that nobody will rent to them. So this is really, really, it's very difficult, and we have so many world-class institutions of higher learning here in the city. We want to make sure that the students can come here, the faculty can come here and stay, that the students, once they graduate, can stay here and move on and enter our workforce and so on. So we really appreciate your continued conversations about this and your focus on this. We really appreciate the work that the schools are doing that are represented here today to find creative, flexible solutions to this problem, and we at the Chamber would like to help in any way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Hi, my name is Sonia Arndt, and I'm a student at UC Hastings, and I'm here to discuss the affordable housing. Hastings is not an affordable school to attend, and is largely due to the lack of affordable housing. We are losing out on top students and faculty because no one can afford to live in the area. Annually, I pay about $25,000 to live in the Tenderloin. Not the best neighborhood. But this is because Hastings has around 200 apartments, currently only able to house about 30% of its student body. That means that 70% of Hastings students have to find student housing outside of Hastings, like myself. That means in addition to paying $50,000 a year in tuition, students are faced with housing fees around $25,000 a year, averaging $2,000 a month, and earlier I heard up to $3,000. I come before you today to ask how you can expect to recruit the next group of top lawyers and faculty in San Francisco when it's literally impossible for students to pay and live in the city that they go to school in. By forcing people out of attending Hastings due to the high cost of living, you're missing out on some of the best students, students from different diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, different genders, races, and ethnicities. Hastings will become a school for the top 1% if our local government doesn't act. A 1% that is primarily made up of white, affluent males. I stand before you today as a woman who grew up in a single-parent household and immigrated to the United States from Europe. I bought into the American dream. I learned the language, the culture, and I worked hard. I even gave back to my country, having served over 3 years in Congress for members in both the House and Senate side. And I plan to give so much more. All I'm asking today is that you give me the chance. Don't have my education fall short because I can't afford to live in the city that my school is located in. A school that is known for its diverse student population, and a school that is ranked top 10 in the nation for public service. Give Hastings students an opportunity to go to school and not be forced out due to lack of affordable housing. And I promise you, you won't regret it. Hastings students were made to shine. All we're asking for is that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello.
Thank you for taking my comment. My name is Samuel Cheng. I am a first-year law student at UC Hastings. And one thing I come to you all is, with only 30% of UC Hastings students to be able to get student dorms, to be in student housing, a lot of the students have to live not only looking for housing in the city, but outside the city. There are some students who couch surf. I had students in my section who couldn't find housing and had to actually miss the first week of classes because they were trying to find some housing somewhere for them. Some ended up living in hotels, using up most of their financial aid because they couldn't find housing. Some students come 1 hour away, living in Dublin, Pleasanton, all these other cities that are completely far away, when they could have easily done and come to this city and be able to live only a block away. But because there's not enough student housing, they're forced to spend most of their time not studying, not being able to go to office hours or doing programming, but unfortunately having to spend the time commuting and spending the money and their financial aid on that. For that very reason, more student housing is essential to be able to bring students here. Because I didn't look at just tuition, but I looked at living costs. And when I saw the living costs be almost as much as me paying tuition, it made me almost reconsider the fact that I would be going to UC Hastings. And there's a lot of students like that. And I believe that if there were more student housing, there would be a greater community in San Francisco, more students would stay here, and more students would start contributing to the city themselves rather than leaving the city when they are done with their law school. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
To San Francisco Board of Supervisors Land Use Committee. Thank you for providing the forum for us here today. My name is Vincent Moita, and I'm a second-year law student at UC Hastings College of Law. Housing is one of the most important issues facing every San Franciscan today. With essentially a 7-by-7 mile grid, San Francisco has very little developable space to accommodate the growing number of residents. In many ways, you as the Board of Supervisors have one of the hardest jobs in the city. Your long-term vision for sustainable growth are often not the solutions that developers want to hear, but your efforts are for the greater good of the city and are much appreciated. People being priced out of San Francisco is echoed among students who are more often than not living on student loans. As the most expensive city in the United States, without adequate, affordable student housing, our school suffers. Currently, UC Hastings has the capacity to house roughly 1/3 of our student population via the UC Hastings Tower. These spaces are highly sought after, and only students who are admitted straight away in early October through December are able to secure a space for the upcoming year. As a student who was admitted off the wait list, I was not able to live in the Hastings Tower and benefit from the lower cost of student housing. This brings up many of the points that Supervisor Wiener brought up in displacing individuals within the Tenderloin area. My story is not unique. In fact, among my immediate peers, many commute from the East Bay, Marin, and San Jose. Some in my 1L section commuted from Gilroy and another from Tracy every day because there's not current space in housing, in student housing, and they cannot afford to live in the city. Long commutes detract from the richness of our educational experience and limit the extent to which students can positively contribute to the civic life through externships, volunteerism, or support small business in the Tenderloin. Having student housing readily available in the close proximity to our school has significantly benefits to our collegiate atmosphere. May I have another 15 seconds?
If you could just wind up the sentence that you were saying.
Over the last 2 years, many group projects became logistical nightmares because of the long-distance commutes and resulting in the cancellation of study sessions and poorly attended after-hour social and community engagement events. But through the San Francisco housing crisis that has affected everyone, UC's Hastings students need this additional space.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tim Cullen on behalf of the Housing Action Coalition, and we're very proud of the role that we played in creating the 2 ordinances that created student housing as a product in San Francisco. The first by Bevan Dufty that got the waiver from inclusionary on student housing. The second one, Supervisor Wiener, was yours, that got the definitions into the planning code to get this going. And we're kind of puzzled at the lack of response to that. We thought that the first one would provide a significant incentive for the creation of a lot of student housing, and a back of the envelope calculation is something like 50 to 60,000 bed shortfall in San Francisco between what's available and what's needed. And in the weeks after the first ordinance passed that granted this waiver from inclusionary, I was getting calls from national student housing builders at the rate of about one a week saying, this is great, we're coming to San Francisco, we're going to build student housing. And weeks and months and then years went by and nothing happened. And I think, Supervisor Wiener, you put your finger on one of the problems. I think you should be looking at what other things could be done that would get this moving faster. And I mean, there are obviously some very good schools here that have stepped up to the challenge and are doing the right things. CCA and UCSF and a lot of these other schools are doing the right thing, but a lot are standing on the sidelines. And I have some ideas of why this is happening, but we're not getting there. A lot of schools don't have the confidence to proceed with the enormous costs or risks that they perceive in undertaking student housing projects. So I think that's an area that I would ask this committee to pursue. Thank you.
And Mr. Cullen, if I may, we welcome specific ideas for ways that we can do that. So just feel free to let us know. Thank you.
My name is Patrick Kennedy. I do have a specific idea that I think will result in quite a bit more student housing being rented by the schools, and that is reducing the minimum term from 5 years to 2 years with an option to renew for another 3. We talked to at least 20 of the schools in San Francisco in the years between 2011 and 2015 when we finished our project. And all of them expressed interest, but almost all of them, except CCA and San Francisco Conservatory of Music, expressed pause at a 5-year commitment because for a couple reasons. Number one, they weren't confident how well the place would be run, and they wanted to have an exit strategy that would allow them to leave if it looked like it wasn't to the liking of their students. And second, they thought that it might impede their efforts to try to raise money to build their own housing. If they had a shorter-term commitment, I am confident that they would agree to rent new purpose-built student housing from developers like myself, which, as David Meckel said, worked out well for all parties. We passed the savings from the inclusionary waiver directly through to the students in the building, and we're able to get financing more easily because we had a building that was pre-leased, or at least a portion of it. So I think if you were to simply reduce the requirement to 2 plus 3 from 5, you would see results. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Supervisors, I'd like to underline, I'm Casey Asbury from the Demonstration Gardens at UC Hastings, and we have been working on exploring the sustainability of affordable housing for students. The long-range campus plan at UC Hastings aspires to recreate the built environment of the campus over 10 years as a carbon-neutral cool island research lab with highest level of LEED certifications available given constraints of capital, technology, and existent structures. This plan for housing at UC Hastings, in partnership with UCSF and others, if we can manage it, or to the extent that we can manage it, is a sustainable measure. We see that we project the high-level impacts as for resilience and sustainability to be reducing pressure on local housing market, which has been emphasized already, modeling a new wave of resilient public buildings, and that hasn't been emphasized. And I think it's really significant because of the Civic Center area is undergoing a large revisualization based on this. We will work with our partners to right size and build shared amenities. We will significantly improve the community fabric through interactions between graduate students and neighborhood access to public service-oriented learning and teaching. And we'd like to invite you to explore this idea further with us.
Thank you very much. Is there any additional public comment? Is there any additional public comment on this item? Please come forward.
Sue Hester. I want to thank the GAO committee for having had a hearing on the institutional master plan ordinance, which is a factor that's not been mentioned yet. The law in San Francisco is that all post-secondary educational institutions have to file an IMP with the planning department and hold public hearings. It doesn't apply to public institutions. The only one of the institutions that was here is CCHC, which I'm so grateful that they're doing the right thing. But when you have an institutional master plan and you take it seriously, you have the ability to give feedback from the Planning Commission to the institution. USF was so is not here, was told they had to regulate the size of their campus and the size of their student body, and they had to build housing. That was a couple of years ago. And USF has done that and is in the process of doing that. When you're a scofflaw, I don't want to mention any institutions, but the initials are AAU, you take up housing in the city from other people, potentially other students. And it's a profit-making entity. Profit-making institutions need to build housing, massive housing, especially if they have 10,000 students come into the city. And so there needs to be a relationship between the institutional master plan and following it, not waiting 25 years to file one, and not waiting to already have 40 sites in the city before you have a very serious hearing. So I am asking the planning department and this board of supervisors to basically tell people we mean it about the IMP and follow through and make them build housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Tom Jones. I'm the former dean of the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, and I currently run our Cal Poly San Francisco architecture program. And I'm really here to speak to, first of all, I'm very grateful to the other institutions of higher learning that are here. I think we in higher education recognize the multiple benefits to building student housing. It's very difficult to do. I served on my own campus's master plan committee when Cal Poly had to enter into long-term development agreements and get complicated financing to do this. I think one of the things to look at is one of the models being explored here is obviously joint venture with private sector developers, but there are tax-exempt bonds and other kind of financing available even to private institutions like AAU and USF that are an important vehicle. I think that obviously this is part of a larger context that the supervisors need to look at is let's get a 5 to 10 year looking backward and looking forward analysis of how many students we have in this city, how much housing was built, how much the various campuses grew, and how much they intend to grow in the future. It sounds to me like we've got really good players here in front of us. I wish that were true for all the universities in this city. I'm afraid some are actively working at this and others are not. So I think you need a full analysis of who's complied or hasn't with an attempt to try and house 50% of the students in San Francisco in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Peskin?
No, I was just thanking Mr. Jones.
Okay. Is there any additional public comment on this item? Okay, seeing none, Madam Chair, may we close public comment?
Public comment is closed at this time. Thank you. Supervisor Wiener, you have any last remarks?
No, I just want to again thank everyone who came out today. And actually, if I could just call the planning department back up. Just wondering if the department has any thoughts on what we've heard today, what we could be doing to try to incentivize more student housing.
Thank you very much, Supervisor Anne Marie Rogers, again, Planning Department staff. I appreciated all the commentary we heard today, and I appreciate the struggles that the universities and colleges are going through to try to help their students get housing. Housing, as we mentioned, is desperately needed in San Francisco on all fronts. One thing that we've heard from developers is that through the amendments that you and Supervisor Dufty made to the planning code, for student housing, you can get sometimes twice the density associated with those developments. So one thing that we could do is to do better work to publicize the opportunity that providing student housing could have, because it is something that allows us to, under existing rules, develop more housing than we could otherwise and could help address that front. I think the only other thing that comes to mind is, it's always a balance in San Francisco between moving things quickly and having enough public process that the community feels like the development is compatible in their neighborhood. And so that conversation of where the community is comfortable in speeding up the process to help the building of housing is one that we struggle with constantly, and I think it's something that we should continue to try to have within the city.
Great, but apart from the process or speeding things up, the legislation that I authored and that former Supervisor Dufty authored was more about, less about the timeline or the process and more about exempting student housing from certain requirements to make it less expensive and also to allow for more units to be in the building. So if planning department staff could perhaps give some thought to ideas that we might be able to move forward with, that would be great.
We'll do that.
Thank you. Okay, Madam Chair, I appreciate the opportunity today, and at this point I would like to move to file this item.
All right. Without objection. Okay. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Clerk, is there anything else before this body?
That completes the agenda for today.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.